they'll agree not to bomb a certain route for 15 minutes. 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are under 18, excuse me. 40% are under 15, and I think 15% are under 5. For every 4,100 people, one toilet and one shower. They were operating without anesthesia. They were doing amputations without anesthesia, C-sections without anesthesia. They didn't have any antibiotics.
We are joined by Feroze Sidhwa, surgeon and educator who has recently been in Gaza working at the European hospital, where he then co-authored a piece about the experience, of which I am very excited to discuss today. But as always, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And if there's any other qualifications you'd like to let the people know in your intro, go ahead.
Oh no, not really. But no, thanks for having me. I'm a trauma surgeon in California, and yeah, I worked at Gaza European Hospital in late March and early April of this year. I'm hoping to go back in November. I'll just let everybody know that I'm in Ghana right now. So if the birds and maybe music start playing outside, I apologize. But yeah.
It'll be culturally relevant. There
Yes.
But so I guess just to jump right into the topic, for the people who might not be as aware, how recently were you in Gaza? And then when you were there, what were kind of the feels on the grounds, like the smells, the sights, the sounds, just to kind of set the stage for people of what it's like there?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Gaza. We entered on March 25th and we left on April 8th. So about 4 or 5 months ago now. And the Gaza's a disaster. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, and I'm pretty sure no one alive has ever seen anything like it. People like the head of the ICRC agree and stuff like that. But when you get there, now that the Israelis have taken the Rafah crossing, they took it on May 7th. The experience of getting there is very different. Something we can go into if you like, but when the way it worked is I got a call for volunteers from the Palestinian American Medical Association, which I'd never even heard of before. I'm Indian by descent, and and then the work was with the World Health Organization in Gaza. So you fly to Cairo, you get there at like 2 in the morning, you leave at 3:30 in the morning to go get onto a UN convoy that's going across the Sinai. You didn't have to go through Kerem Shalom, which is controlled by the Israelis. When you go through Kerem Shalom, which is what you do now, they don't let you take anything in other than your personal belongings. So your shirt, your pants, if you take your own medicines, that's basically it. Which means that now very, very little of that these hospitals need is actually getting through. But so you get through, you go over to the Palestinian side of the border, and then you get into a van, and then you have to wait for deconfliction to happen, which is you probably know the storied history of that. But if it's this kind of catch-22, if you don't tell the Israelis, if you don't request deconfliction from the Israelis, meaning that they'll agree not to bomb a certain route for 15 minutes as soon as it turns green on a smartphone app, then if you take that route and they kill you, everyone's going to say it's your fault. And if you do tell them where you are, but they've already decided that they want to kill you, now they know exactly where you are. That's almost certainly what happened with the World Central Kitchen killings, for example. When you get to European Hospital, it's incredible. There's like 10 to 15,000 people sheltering on the grounds of the hospital, but not just on the grounds, also inside of the hospital itself. It was really amazing, and it's not there anymore, but it was really amazing. In the corridors, so there were people, not patients, keep in mind. There were just people, families living in the corridors. They had set up tents from the detritus of people's houses and all sorts of other stuff. And they're just living there. They're cooking there. They do all the things that you do when you're living. It's just an utter disaster. Most of the hospital staff, Khan Yunis has been completely destroyed. It's not a municipal entity anymore. It just doesn't exist. So most of the hospital staff actually live in the hospital now. So the scrub techs and circulators live in the operating room. The sterile processing folks live in the sterile processing facility. There was an anesthesiologist who lived in the we had 6 or 7 now, 7, I don't know, 6 or 7 people in the same room. And then the other half of our team slept in another room with the same number. And right next to us was an anesthesiologist living with his four daughters. Their home had been bombed. His wife and son had been killed. And I remember he told me this story. We were walking back, excuse me, we were walking back from an operation that we did together, and uh I asked him, I was like, why do you live in that little room right there? I saw I assume those are your kids in there. He was like, yeah, my house was bombed. My wife and kid were killed. And I was like, man, how do you deal with that? How do you, because he was actually the most enthusiastic anesthesiologist, other than the one we brought with us. He was the most enthusiastic anesthesiologist that we had there. He didn't seem, quote unquote, burned out or whatever term you want to use. Um, and I just remember he got really quiet, and in the Arab society is not a quiet society at all. He got really quiet, and he was like, I uh, feel like I have to show my children that life can go on, but I feel completely dead inside. I don't feel like there's any point to life anymore.
Yeah.
And it was shocking just to the devastation of this war is really, even leaving aside the physical and structural devastation, the psychological devastation it's going to be with people for generations. And I mean, it's not, and it's important. I'm sure but just for people listening, it's important to remember this is hardly the first time Gaza has been destroyed. It's hard, there's a lot of, it's hard to describe in full, obviously. The one thing that you really notice is just the unbelievable, overwhelming presence of children. It's a very, very young territory, like more, I think
It's
I
like
might have the numbers
50%
wrong at the
under
moment.
18 or
Sorry?
something. It's like 50.
Yeah. So 50% of Gazans are under 18. And actually, I was told Gazans is a politically incorrect term. You're supposed to say Palestinians in Gaza, sorry. But the 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are under 18, excuse me. 40% are under 15, and I think 15% are under 5.
Oh,
So it's a
wow.
very, very young territory. And so there's just kids everywhere, and it's kind of a cultural thing in the Arab world. Children just kind of run wild until they hit like 10 or 12 years old. So the kids are just like, they're trying to play with anything they can find because they have no toys. Like, everything's been destroyed. They're just literally trying to play with anything they can find. So someone like throws some rock at you or something. No, not like to hurt you, but just like it just happens to hit you, stuff like that. Or two kids are wrestling and they just run into you. And so there's just kids everywhere all the time, and it's incredible. um they're all malnourished. They're all shorter than they should be. Not just, again, they're not malnourished just since October 7th. They're malnourished they're actually, if you think about it, if they were 18, they were born in what, 2006, is that the right math?
Yeah.
So that means that they were all born under Israeli blockade, not just occupation, but the blockade of Gaza. Or actually, I guess, sorry, since they were 1 year old at maximum, they lived under the blockade of Gaza. So, and it's not appreciated how devastating that blockade was, but when the blockade was imposed in 2007, when Hamas kind of preempted an American, Israeli, and Fatah coup against the election, because remember, they won the elections the year before. And then there was a coup attempt led by Hillary Clinton and others. Or excuse me, not led by Hillary Clinton, led by Condoleezza Rice and others. After they overthrew the coup in Gaza, and Fatah basically didn't exist in Gaza at that point. The Israelis imposed a complete land, sea, and air blockade. The sea blockade came a little bit afterwards, but a complete land, air, and sea blockade. Everything stinks, obviously, because it's no way for these people to keep clean. There's a report just out from Oxfam. It's called Water War Crimes, if I'm remembering correctly. And they, again, it's kind of nice to see your own personal observations reflected in actual data, so okay, I'm not insane. So they calculated that since October 7th, there's been 4.7 liters of water available to every person in Gaza per day, and not for drinking, but for all purposes, for cooking, for cleaning, for drinking, for bathing, like literally everything, which is way below even the standard, the minimum standard in a humanitarian emergency, which is, I think, is 15 liters in the Sphere handbook. And then we took a day, or I took a day and went through, we weren't supposed to leave the hospital, but I wanted to see Rafah and Khan Yunis if I could. So we took a day and went through we went through Rafah, which is the southern city in Gaza on the border with Egypt, and then the Mawasi area, the southern part of it, which is the humanitarian system Israel's pushing everybody into. Um, and I remember, I got there and I knew from looking at the map, but when I got there and stood there, I was like, this is just a beach. That they're pushing these people onto a humanitarian zone that is clearly just a beach. Like it doesn't even have the structural integrity to build anything on it. You know what I mean? Like it's just wild. So Oxfam estimated that if Israel is actually able to push 1 million people into this zone, which is what they're trying to do, there'll be, if I'm remembering correctly, 2.4 liters of water. But by the way, none of this water is potable. This is all like poison water, but at least it exists. There'll be 2.4 liters of water per person per day. And there'll be one toilet. You'll be shocked by this. If I remember the numbers correctly, for every 4,100 people, one toilet and one shower.
Wow.
Nothing like that exists anywhere else in the world. You can find the poorest part of sub-Saharan Africa. There's more than one toilet for every 4,100 people. It's just shocking. It's absolutely outrageous. And when you're there, it's hard to you get a sense of these. You can't calculate the numbers just by looking, obviously, but you get a sense of what's going on. There's raw sewage flowing down literally every street that has that still exists. It's an incredibly desperate situation.
And it's to note, like what you said about some of the attacks before October 7th and things that people don't know about. It's crazy, shocking the amount of people who think that all this started on October 7th, and before then it was like golden sunshine and rainbows. And that's something I try to do with my channel, is like it's been long coming for decades now that these kind of situations have been imposed upon the Palestinians.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's not by accident, because it's there were two things done in the media after October 7th. One was to, like you said, pretend that Gaza was it was Monaco. I don't know why they went crazy. They had all these casinos. It was great. It's completely ridiculous. There's it was interesting in the I remember reading or maybe I was listening to a talk. I can't remember, but you know who Noam Chomsky is. You've heard the name before. Yeah, so the Chomsky gave a talk, or maybe it was, I can't remember if it was something he wrote or something he said, but regardless, he gave what he pointed out was that in the 80s, meaning during Reagan's assault on South America, the media had to create a new class of expert on Latin America because no academic expert would say anything they wanted to hear about El Salvador or Guatemala or Nicaragua, or they were all just horrified by what was being done. They knew the history, so they were like, yeah, no, the Salvadoran government is committing genocide in the mountains. They've kind of had to do the same thing. That's why you almost never see so and so is a professor of Arab Israeli studies, or so and so is a professor of Middle Eastern history, or so, like, you just don't see that on TV, because those people will go on, and even if they'll say, yeah, Hamas is terrible, the Palestinians are all nutcases, blah, blah, blah. Even if they'll say that, they'll say, but, I mean, we all know what was going on in Gaza before October 7th. So it's not like they had no reason to, it's not like they just woke up one day and decided to murder a bunch of helpless people. Like, that's not what happened, So they literally had to create this new class of people to do this. It's just shocking. That's why Alan Dershowitz gets on TV. That guy doesn't know anything about anything. Like, he literally has never, I seriously, and I mean this completely seriously, I seriously doubt he's ever read a book on the topic. I doubt he's ever read like anything serious on the topic. He's kind of an imbecile. And yet he can get on TV as soon as he wants to. You can just go on.
One of the other parts in the piece that you co-authored that I wanted to ask you about, that I thought was one of the more horrendous things that you mentioned, not on part of your writing, but just on part of what happened, was the evidence you saw of deliberate attacks on not just civilians, but children at that. Could you maybe describe some of what that was that you saw?
You can argue, I don't think it's a good argument at when it's happening at this scale, but you could argue, look, we bombed Hamas and there's, half of Gaza is children. There just happened to be a kid nearby. It's not our fault that the kid got blown up in the process. Okay, not, there's certainly subtleties to that, but nevertheless, it's an argument that someone can understand, right? You're like, look, when you drop, if you're going to use a bomb, bombs explode. Fine. It's not good, but we all accept that the physical universe is what it is. But children getting shot in the head and chest is very, very different from that. That is a directed and clearly deliberate decision and I'm not talking about 17 and a half-year-old kids. I'm talking about like preteen and younger. So we saw quite a lot of that. So I actually went back and added up how many children I had seen shot like in center mass in when I was in Gaza, and it was 13 in 12 actual days of work.
Mhm.
And that's again in one hospital in this on the southeastern edge of Khan Yunis. There's plenty of other shooting going on. So when I got back, I kind of assumed at the time that there was just kind of some like some unusually sadistic unit or sadistic sniper who happens to be around and is doing all this murdering. Um, and yeah, I was horrified by it, but there's certainly nothing I could do about it. But when I got back, I went to a conference in Dearborn where they asked me to give a little talk, and so I was talking to Thayer, and I said, one thing that just blew me away was how many kids we saw shot in the head. And he had been at a different hospital. He had been on the western edge of Khan Yunis. I was on the southeastern side. And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I couldn't believe that too." I was like, "What is going on?" I was like, "Oh, wait, you also saw this?" So, and I don't know if you saw this, but I wrote a letter to the Biden administration that I should say, we wrote a letter to the Biden administration, me and some other people, and 45 people total signed it, physicians and nurses who've worked in Gaza since October 7th. And one of the things we emphasize is that all of us saw children shot in the head and chest.
Mhm.
And again, we're not talking about like fighting age children, because a 17-year-old can pick up a gun. Nobody, and it doesn't mean they did pick up a gun. That's a very different question, but they can. But preteen children do not participate in combat, no matter what you think of Hamas. No matter, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Especially 2-year-olds. I mean, that's absurd.
Mhm.
So when you see children that young shot in the head and chest consistently across multiple time periods in multiple different locations, um, it's just not that hard to figure out that this is being done deliberately. Uh, Now, do I think, and it doesn't really matter what I think, I'm not some kind of military expert, but do I think that, like, Defense Minister, what's his name, Gallant, I think, the Defense Minister is issuing an order to kill 10 children by shooting them in the head today? I'd seriously doubt that. That's kind of silly. But it's perfectly obvious that it's being tolerated by the Israeli army. It's so widespread. It's been going on for months and months and months and months. And furthermore, it's actually not even new to Gaza. Like if you look at B'Tselem, that's Israel's human rights, the main information center for human rights in the territories. If you look at that, they have a report. If you go to their website, they have a topics list, and you can go to open fire policy. That's one of them. And they describe how in the West Bank, where there is no state of armed conflict, yeah, there's a lot of, there's a lot of unrest. And there's certainly shooting occasionally. But there's no war going on.
Yeah.
And even before October 7th, you can go back and look at it. The Israeli army has an open fire policy and the way they put it are soldiers are almost never punished for recklessly and deliberately firing into civilians. Well,
It's crazy.
and like actually the most recent example that I saw that they had was a kid who was sitting in the back of a car. And his dad was backing out of the driveway and a bullet just hit the kid in the head. We have to understand that Israel has decided what it's going to do. Israel is set on a policy, and we shouldn't be too harsh on them. Like, we did exactly the same thing here. That's why I'm happen to be in Ghana right now, but that's why when I'm sitting in California, it's not Indian tribes that are around me. It's for lack of a better term, it's a white society. We did the same thing, and we did it over hundreds of years. It's not like it happened, like the Indian genocide ended in about the late 50s, and it's going to continue along in it if we support them in doing it. We are by far the only, not by far, we are the only relevant player other than Israel and the Palestinians. The Germans can do whatever they want. The British can do whatever they want. China can do whatever. It doesn't matter. The U.S. funds Israel to the hilt and is the only reason that the project of destroying Palestinian society can keep going forward. And if we stop funding it, it'll stop immediately. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I want to ask too.
there should be accountability, but from us, we are the ones who should be holding ourselves accountable.
Definitely. Yeah. And I also wanted to ask, you kind of mentioned the malnourishment and the starvation, and I'm sure it's even set in more now, but when you were
Yeah.
there, even how much did that kind of play effect in terms of not just like recovery, but like ability to operate when needed and these sorts of things?
It was a disaster. Every incision that I made in a patient in an emergency setting, like again, I'm a trauma surgeon, so that's mostly what I do. Every incision got infected, every single one without exception. If you are malnourished, you're not going to heal wounds, and unhealed wounds get infected eventually. That's just what it is. So it was a total disaster. we saw, external fixators. That's like when you have the pins on the outside and a rod going across them to stabilize a bone. We saw external fixators that have been on for months and months with no healing of the bone. That's very, very unusual. That's really, really strange. All right, as I say, it's strange. It's not strange at all. It's perfectly explainable. But it's the issue of malnutrition. And yeah, the issue of malnutrition is a major, major problem. It's actually, and like you mentioned, it's actually getting worse, not better. Um, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification is the technical group that monitors food insecurity in the world. They put out a report in June. I think maybe they have a new one. I haven't checked yet. But they put out a report in June. That was their third report on Gaza, saying that in April up until May 7th, food delivery to Gaza had actually increased enough to stave off literal famine. That doesn't mean people aren't dying of starvation. They are. They still put about 500,000 people in what's called the catastrophic phase of food insecurity. And at that rate, two people out of 10,000 every day die of starvation related causes. So that's pretty bad. You can do the math for how many people it is, or likely to be. But famine is a more society-wide categorization. It requires certain metrics to be met. And actually, the IPC said it might actually be that Gaza is in famine, but we can't gather any real data, so we don't know. But leaving that aside, there was still a huge amount of food insecurity, far beyond anything else that's anywhere else in the world, in terms of the percentage of the society that's food insecure. And after May 7th, after the closure of Rafah, the food deliveries went way down. I think they dropped by almost half. And beyond that, the emergency nutrition centers that were in Rafah and Khan Yunis were I think about half of them, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, were destroyed. Those are the centers where people who have actual like life-threatening malnutrition can go get medically supervised feeding, usually with a tube put down their nose, stuff like that. Because that's a medically complicated thing. You can't just be like, oh, here, eat this pizza and you'll be fine. It's something that takes, weeks to resolve, especially in children. So yeah, the malnutrition is actually really, really, it's getting worse. It's not getting better, unfortunately.
I did want to ask though, because you mentioned about how now there's crossings blocked that weren't when you went and you were able to get some supplies in. I wanted to ask about like the ability to perform even the most basic of duties. Maybe you had a better experience being able to get some supplies in, but maybe not just from lack of supplies, but from, I'm sure, like bombings or hearing explosions around, and even just like the constant fear of an attack. Were you kind of hindered from being able to perform duties that otherwise should have been rather menial?
So the bombing was continuous. It wasn't the bombings weren't on the hospital, thankfully, while we were there. There was, shooting was audible most of the time. Bombings, and the bombings literally happened every like 3 to 4 minutes. These would shake the hospital. They would knock stuff off the tables sometimes. They did blow out some windows on the third floor of the hospital. It wasn't, but there were no Israeli soldiers like in the hospital or stopping anybody from doing anything. Now, obviously, the lack of supplies is one aspect to it, but the biggest problem is just the overwhelming volume of patients that need care. Like just like forget anybody who's even injured, like today, say. When I got there, the day, so March 26th, it would have been. I went around with a newly formed wound care team, just a team that goes and looks at wounds and tries to take care of them properly. It took us 3 days to see everybody in the hospital with a significant open wound. And I can't remember, I counted, but I think it was something like 200 or 250 people who needed surgical wound care, not just like, I'm going to change your dressing, just like, they needed a surgeon to take them to the operating room, do debridement or do some kind of plastic surgery or whatever it might be, to get this person healed and actually able to get out of the hospital. There's 4 operating rooms at European Hospital. How are you going to take care of 250 people that, like, you'd have to occupy every OR? Let's see, you can maybe, if you really push those kinds of cases, you could probably do 4 a day on average, maybe 5. So 5, 20, so that's 10 to 15 days of just doing that, ignoring everyone who comes into the hospital needing emergency care. that's the level of assault that this population has endured. The medical needs are just completely overwhelming. So uh, I wouldn't say our work was impeded by anything other than, I mean, again, the overwhelming presence of the fact that the hospital was a displaced persons camp made it difficult to work there. Infections meant, or the general lack of cleanliness and the malnutrition made it so that every operation was 3 times harder, because it's not going to go well. You're going to have to come back for an infection, drain the infection, another operation, things like that. The lack of adequate supplies meant that you were not using necessarily the correct suture or the right type of suture or the right size, whatever. We couldn't, and this is, I never even would have guessed this. There's no soap. There's no soap anywhere in Gaza right now. A bottle of shampoo, I'm told, is sold for $30, like not shekels, dollars. That's absolute insanity. You know what I mean? There's no soap in Gaza, so like I literally, as a surgeon, can't wash my hands. I'm just rubbing betadine on which is ridiculous. Like, doesn't do anything. Um, uh, yeah, and again, just to emphasize, European hospital when I was there was the best hospital in Gaza. It's the other hospitals were far worse off. They basically had nothing. When people that went to Aqsa Martyrs Hospital or Nasser Medical Complex, they were operating without anesthesia. They were doing amputations without anesthesia, C-sections without anesthesia. They didn't have any antibiotics. We did, because we had brought some ourselves. They had no, they were actually, we thankfully didn't have to reuse unsterilized instruments. We did in the emergency room, but that was different. But we didn't have to reuse unsterilized instruments there. They don't even have sterile capacities anymore, because they don't have the electricity for it.
Definitely. And I wanted to, we do have a hard out in just about 1 or 2 minutes, so maybe quickly, but I did want to end on one more question, kind of just not necessarily looking forward, but more about the United States and our role in it. What would your message be to our government, where even after all this evidence coming out, I mean, the uncommitted movement, Biden at least seems ideologically unmovable on the issue. With Harris, there's more optimism at least, but with our seemingly unbreakable alliance of sorts with Israel, you never really know. What would your personal message, someone who's been there and experienced it firsthand, what would your message be to the United States government?
Just stop. I don't know politically how that happens, but the U.S. government just needs to stop funding this absolute lunacy. And the U.S. is not a friend of Israel. The U.S. is exploiting Israel just like it exploits everybody else. But if the U.S. wants to be a friend of Israel, this is certainly not the way to do it, by getting their leaders dragged before the International Criminal Court, their whole country's major political project for the past 50 years implicated at The Hague, the whole world turning against them, the whole world being convinced that anti-Semitic stereotypes are actually true. This is a disaster, and we have to pull back from the brink, or it's just going to get worse.
I completely agree with you. So I want to say thank you again for taking time to speak with us. Thank you for the meaningful work you do, not only just in Gaza, but I saw in your piece you've worked all over the world. So I appreciate that. I mean, you're in Ghana right now, as you said. So that's wonderful, meaningful work. And I just appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to shed some light on this conflict.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.